A very good morning to you. 1 minute after 10 is the time. And coming up on the programme today, as things stand, and you know I always reserve the right to change my mind. Do you remember the Mickey Mouse degrees we used to talk about many, many moons ago? They're back in the news, although the definition, the description of what constitutes a Mickey Mouse degree has changed. I have embarrassed myself in the past in describing degrees as Mickey Mouse and subsequently realising that they were actually very important areas of study and somewhat ahead of their time. Most obviously in the arena of media studies, which when I was a young person hoping to go into the media, I thought was an absolute waste of time. My late father used to lump it in with babby washing. He'd say, you might as well get a degree in babby washing as media studies. Of course, what we were discussing yesterday about how you teach children how to recognise fake news is, when you think about it, media studies. So are the new, allegedly Mickey Mouse degrees going to prove to be similarly different from some of the prejudices of people like me? We will find out. Also, in the second hour of the programme at the moment, we're going to look at inequality in schools, and we're going to conduct the conversation in full cognizance of the fact that I attended a school that had an 18-hole golf course and a beagle pack. But when you look at the gulf in attainment between schools full of very privileged people and the other end of the privilege scale, so many questions arise. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, addressing some of them, and we will address others after 11. But we begin... And you can always tell, you know, can I confide in you briefly, please? You can always tell when we are about to talk about a story that I find really difficult to process, because I do that thing there where I tell you what's coming up later in the programme. I'm buying time. I don't do that every day, do I? How often do I come on air at 10 o'clock and tell you what's happening at 11 or at 12? I think if I was a more professional radio presenter, I'd probably do it on a more regular basis. But generally, when you catch me doing it, it means that the conversation we're about to have is one that I find emotionally harrowing. I've never developed, in all the years I've been doing this, I've never developed that ability to switch off. That's why I could never be a foreign correspondent. I couldn't go to a war zone. I certainly couldn't cover famine or anything where you would be charged with reporting something horrible unfolding in front of you without intervening yourself. It's a failing of mine. I couldn't keep objective distance. And there are stories that come up in the course of our time together that I really don't want to talk about. And I know sometimes that I have to. And today we have to talk about the families of the victims of Valdo Callicane, one of whom Nick has just been talking to, Barnaby Webber's mum. And we have to talk about the reality of mental health treatment in this country at the moment. I don't like phrases like blood on their hands. I don't like it when a tragedy happens and our desperation to find someone to blame leads us down very predictable and obvious paths. Social services, for example, almost all of the time are doing their very, very best in incredibly and increasingly difficult circumstances. But this Panorama programme that's due to be broadcast it's a piece of work. They have found, I beg your pardon, not due to be broadcast. The damning report, which is out today, shows errors, omissions, misjudgments by professionals. It shows warnings. It shows that clinicians minimised or omitted key details that would have exposed the serious risk he posed to the public. It details occasions where essentially warnings of the tragedy that would unfold were almost specifically made. The long history of being sectioned, of committing crimes, of being put into the care of GPs who sort of lost track of him. It is genuinely a cavalcade of chaos. And it hinges upon 2 or 3 central points. The first of which is, what do you do if somebody won't help themselves? I'll read you this from Andrew, which has come in already. I know 3 people with schizophrenic children. All are managed by medication, and all of these friends report the difficulty of getting them to take their meds long term. Once they feel better, they stop taking the pills under the delusion that they're cured when there is no cure. ceasing your meds as a schizophrenic is not evidence of a rational mind. That's got to be true as well. I don't know if you're aware of an element of this story that is ethically quite raw, and that is that it was suggested, indeed it was essentially diagnosed, that he should take an injection of a much more powerful dose of antipsychotic medication that would last much, much longer than oral medication. But he had a personal preference. Valdo Callicane had a personal preference for the oral medication, which he then failed to take. So the question of whether or not, and this is the found, I was listening to the radio this morning as I cycled into work, and I pulled over for a second at this point just to make sure I was listening properly, because the idea of forcibly injecting somebody at first glance sounds a little bit 19th century, doesn't it? It's a little bit Victorian. But if the alternative is to leave someone who has repeatedly demonstrated their inability to responsibly self-medicate, then what is the alternative? It leads to tragedy. It leads to death. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. Systemic issues that the Care Quality Commission review has found with community mental health care, including a shortage of staff. How many times have we talked about that? A lack of integration with other support services, including the police. I think those two phenomena go hand in hand. And 4 admissions in 2 years. Disengagement, refusal to take medicine. I think what must be hardest for the families of Ian Coates, Barnaby Webber and Grace O'Malley Kumar to deal with is the knowledge that this could have been avoided. This could have been stopped. And the family of Valdo Callicane, who appeared on last night's Panorama programme, essentially know that. They said that the records they were given after the killings showed that a psychiatrist was so worried in 2020 that they warned that perhaps Valdo will end up killing someone. And my inbox is pinging already. This is it's a really tough one. Care in the community only works with people who are engaged with care in the community. Otherwise, it needs to be a confinement, doesn't it? So the question that I want to talk about, or the issue that I want to talk about today, is what it's like to know that your loved one, as a consequence of their mental illness, is a danger to themselves, and more pertinently, I think for today's purposes, either potentially or actually a danger to others. There's an almost Kafkaesque element to this, isn't there? A sort of anxiety dream sense that you can see tragedy on the road ahead and you can warn about it, but people are not listening to you, or the people who have the power to prevent the tragedy are not responding to the urgency of your warnings. It's like that, the reason I mention anxiety dreams, it's like when you scream in a dream and nothing comes out of your mouth. You can't quite believe that these warnings are going unheeded, and there are, I do believe that the massive majority of people working in these sectors are doing their best in incredibly and increasingly difficult circumstances. But every profession, every workplace in the world has people who fail, people who do not rise to the challenge of their duties. And it's pretty clear from this CQC report that Valdo Callicane's journey to that fateful day in Nottingham was dotted with instances where more could have been done and tragedy could have been averted. This phrase here, gross systematic failures. Extraordinary. So that's what I would like to know. What is it like to love somebody who is likely to hurt themselves and you believe likely to hurt others? But the experience I want to examine today is the experience of not knowing where to turn and what happens when you do turn to the only places that you can. How, because these stories come along with horrible regularity, with a sort of grim frequency. They're rare, but they're regular. And it speaks to, as the family have said in response to the CQC report, it speaks to gross systematic failures, but on a personal level, at a familial level, what actually happens. So your brother, your partner, your son, your sister, your mother, your wife, they have probably schizophrenia in the context of this conversation, but they have mental health issues so profound that you know they pose a threat to themselves and to others. But the help, the expertise, the response you would expect in those circumstances is not forthcoming. What actually happens in those moments? What happens in that moment? You know your loved one needs help. What's it like when you don't get it? Why do you think you don't get it? Knowing what you know about your experiences with your family, what can you tell the rest of us about this story that might help us come to a better understanding of how it could happen? How can there be a meeting in 2020 that involves a psychiatrist saying perhaps this patient will end up killing someone, and then the patient is freed to ultimately kill someone, but as a consequence of not taking medication, not doing the things that the care in the community program needed him to do? Discharged in July 2020, diagnosis sent to his GP. Later that year, he admitted to his community mental health team that he'd lied to doctors about no longer hearing voices because he didn't want to be in hospital anymore. His mental health nurse told doctors he was missing appointments, not taking his tablets. It was her that suggested the long-lasting injection known as a depot, D-E-P-O-T injection, but it didn't happen. I guess I'm also asking, and I'm asking this question very responsibly, I'm asking whether there's a sort of desperation involved in thinking it could have been avoided. I mean, what would you do? Strap him down and inject him? Keep him locked up in a secure unit? Was it? Can these things be avoidable? Or do they simply make us feel that they should have been avoided because the profundity of these tragedies and the experiences of these families are so deep, are so horrible? It's 10:15. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. As we contemplate a report that suggests very, very strongly that 3 people would still be alive today if the treatment of a patient called Valdo Callicane had been better, I want to know why you are less shocked by this story than the rest of us because of what you have seen and been through with your loved one, who you know could pose a danger to themselves and to others, but who you also know does not get the help, the treatment, or perhaps a more robust response that you know they need. 16 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. You can also use that number to WhatsApp me, but obviously I think in this kind of space, hearing your story and being able to ask you questions is better, but I know not everybody will be comfortable ringing in, so I'll do my best to read as many of your written messages as I can as well. It's 10:16. 10:18. I've done it again, haven't I? I've done a lengthy introduction, but in many ways the question that I'm asking is quite straightforward and one that is going to be better answered by people with personal experience. And it's a question really about How can you help a seriously ill person, a mentally ill person, a dangerously mentally ill person if they won't help themselves? What do you do? What does the state do? What does the system do? What's it like for the family member? Because it is this catalogue of refusing to do what was required of him, partly because I presume, looking at some of the stories you're sending in, that you can, a consequence of the illness can be your ability to convince yourself that you are better. But there was a time and time again, he didn't do the things that he needed to do to stay well. So how do you help someone who is not helping themselves? Let's start in Glasgow. Greg's there. Greg, what would you like to say? What can you tell us?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Mate, I've been listening to you for years and I'm a big fan. So this is I had to phone up because what you're asking is exactly kind of what I've went through myself with my brother and my family. I actually thought I put it to bed until I started talking to your producer, and then I started getting upset. So I apologise if I start getting a bit tearful about it. But
well, you take all the time you want. All right.
I've got two brothers, and the middle brother, he started displaying signs of just not being right a number of years ago, and probably through excessive alcohol and drug use. And he started thinking that we were poisoning him, and then he would barricade himself into his room and just be really up and down and all over the place. And we're like, you need to go and get some professional help. We can't do this for you. You know, my mum was trying to help him. I was trying to help him. I eventually managed to get him to the doctors. But as for what happened after that is anybody's guess. And ultimately, I knew he was going to be, I thought he was going to hurt somebody.
Right.
He was going to hurt himself. He was going to hurt somebody else. And what ended up happening was probably the most if he had killed somebody, you would almost been able to put that to bed. But He was found being indecent to a young girl. And you just can't understand just how horrific that actually is. And we went through the court system. He was found guilty. He got 4.5 years. This was back in 2016, I think, 2018. And yeah, we tried to be there for him, and even through the prison system, trying to get him the help. And I think he was eventually diagnosed with split personality disorder and schizophrenia.
Right.
So he was on antipsychotics after we pleaded with people to try and get him help. When you're in prison and he's not saying he needs help, he was,
I don't know whether anyone would know. I think you're close to telling me that you don't believe the crimes would have been committed if the diagnosis and the treatment had been in place sooner. We can never know that for sure, but the idea, where you're speaking directly to the questions I've been asking, and I understand that it's so direct it must be difficult for you, is how do you help someone that won't help themselves, or someone who doesn't even think that they've got a problem?
He didn't think he had a problem. He thought it was us that was the problem. He thought it was us that was trying to poison him, and he wouldn't do. I fought tooth and nail to try. I'm his big brother, right? I'm protective of my wee brother. So before the incident happened, I managed to get him to go and see the doctor, but but then I suspect it was too late.
Yeah.
It was too far gone, and whatever was put in place, because I think they just gave him antidepressants or something like that, so they didn't fully understand.
You must have thought about this a lot, and if all right, you may not have done, but what could have been done differently, do you think?
To be fair, when you go to the doctors and you say you're not feeling well, and part of it would have needed to be, I suppose, one of us going into the doctors with him.
But he's an adult and he doesn't want you to.
Exactly. So you can't force that, right? But
no.
You've got to allow him to go in, and you trust what he says to the doctor. And ultimately, what he says to the doctor it's like trying to get power of attorney almost. You want to try and take away his right to talk, but you're not able to because he doesn't think he's got a problem. So therein lies the conundrum. And he just went in and probably said something like he's not feeling quite right and blah, 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 blah. No going into it in too much detail because he doesn't feel like he's got a problem. And the doctors just went and said, there's some fluoxetine. Go ahead. You've,
And then there's no guarantee he'd take that anyway.
Exactly. And he didn't. And it wasn't until he was in prison and he was under almost 24-hour watch and people were aware of kind of his inability to be cognitive enough for people to understand that he actually had a problem. And we raised it through the prison system,
So without being jailed, the scrutiny wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
But by the time he's jailed, it's too late for his victim.
Yeah. It's mental. I mean, it's ripped the family apart. My mum will never be the same. My other brother's changed his name.
Really?
I've never. I thought I put it to bed until I just started talking about it again. But I should have been protective of my brother, But you can't. You can't do that, and I can't be. I'm in a relatively high-profile job now, and I can't be seen to be associated with that kind of stuff because it's affected previous jobs.
Oh man, well, it will leach. It shouldn't do, should it? But it will leach into every corner of your existence because it's unfolded on the public stage. What's his situation now? What's your brother's situation now?
Well, he's out of prison now. He came out of prison, and as far as I was led to believe, the stupid thing. I mean, it's crazy. The services put him back into the area in which the crime was committed, which is just mental. I just don't understand it, really, to be fair. But he was in secured accommodation on his own, and then people got wind of him, wind of who he was and where he was, and the house ended up being surrounded by about 100 people. He was then escorted out by the police, and I don't know where he is now because I had to cut ties at that point.
And do you forgive me if I'm prying, Greg?
Sure.
But do you live in a state of hypervigilance now? Do you every time your phone rings, does it cross your mind that it could be? He
was assaulted in prison. I thought he was going to. I've been waiting on a phone call saying he's going to be killed or something like that. But the adverse effect of what you're actually going through as a person. I mean, I'm just a person. I'm a dad and a husband, and I'm hyper vigilant about how I am around other children. I shouldn't have to be, but I'm so conscious of. And you almost be standoffish with it because you just don't want to, well, your brother done that, and you don't want, you can't be associated with that kind of stuff, and it just the list just goes on for how it's actually had a negative impact on all of our lives.
I can't begin. Well, I have an inkling now, having listened to you tell your story so courageously, I would say, because it helps the rest of us come to a better understanding of these imponderables. But it's only an inkling, Greg. I've nothing but sympathy for you and your family, and especially your mum, from the way that you tell the story. 27 minutes after 10. I don't think I'll go to Mary just yet because squeezing these sort of stories into tiny slots on the program is probably inappropriate. But I have to tell you, one message that's come in has completely got me. This is my lad. James, you met him at your book signing in Manchester. I think that Greg just reminded us of the importance of trigger warnings. So he was triggered by this conversation. And I know a lot of people take the mickey out of that phrase, but it's important to remember there are people that don't understand anything, all right? And they revel in not understanding things, and there's a lot of it about. In fact, while I'm on the subject of that kind of irresponsible, sort of provocative ignorance, whenever tragedies occur, there is, sadly now in space, tragedies or atrocities, the likelihood of mental health having played a part in the process is quite high, particularly the crimes that we find hardest to process, hardest to understand. And yet there is a certain constituency of people now who are faster than Usain Bolt when it comes to insisting that they don't want to hear anything about mental health. There's a desperation to believe that there is a sort of ethnic or genetic predisposition towards violent crime. We've talked about it a lot for obvious reasons over the last week and a half. And those are the people who are, certainly in the context of public discourse, that they are partly responsible for the failure to properly recognise the significance and the danger of untreated mental health conditions. because of course there is no ethnic or genetic predisposition to violence. It's just that if you are a massive racist or a white supremacist, then you need to seek to believe that there is. But this one got me, and there's a trigger warning here regarding suicide, okay? And I can't see the picture, David. I don't know if you attached it. This is my lad, James. You met him at your book signing in Manchester. He took his own life 2 months ago. He'd been sectioned 4 times, just like Valdo Calacane. And we as a family have real concerns and questions about his care, his prescriptions, the non-joined-up nature of secondary care, and the private mental health hospital that was used. A&E was chaotic. We're currently going through a coroner's inquest. My love to you and your family, David, and my reminder to everybody else that will be the much more common experience. Looking at my inbox, it is a much more common experience where the person you love hurts themselves, possibly fatally. The reason why Valdo Calacane's story, and there's nothing wrong with this is how things are and how they should be, but the reason why his story is receiving the level of examination and scrutiny is because he took other lives, not his own. But the journey to the taking of the life will be very, very similar. Very similar. 10:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It is 10:33. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I found the picture, David. I remember your boy, and I am so sorry for your loss. I really am. And grateful to you for reminding us that most stories about failure in mental health care will lead to or most tragedies about failure in mental health care will involve the patient's death, as opposed to, in the case of Valdo Calacane, complete strangers that he'd never met before, Barnaby Webber, Ian Coates and Grace O'Malley Kumar. And that's why the scrutiny is in place in this case. If he had only taken his own life, then it simply wouldn't be. And I'm not saying that is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the thing. It's how things are. Mary is in the Gower in South Wales. Mary, what would you like to say? What made you pick up the phone?
I have to say this is really difficult for me, so I hope I can articulate it well enough.
Take all the time you want.
I want to say that first of all, I want to say how sorry I am for the families who lost loved ones in Nottingham. Yeah. But also, because losing a child, losing a sibling is just a horrendous, life-changing event. But I also have huge empathy for the family of Valdo Calacane. I've been in both situations. I lost my daughter almost 2 years ago. She had schizophrenia. She was failed categorically by mental health services for the 5 years that she was seriously ill. As a family, we were desperate for help. We cried out for help and she had multiple admissions in that time. But between those times, we were left to just cope with something that we just had no idea how to cope with. We weren't trained. We had no idea how to help her. She was compliant with medication, so it wasn't the same as this particular case. She wanted to be well. She so wanted to be well. But other than just injecting her with drugs once a month, there was nothing to help her. And she ended up... Well, the only way we could get help for her on each occasion was to wait until she either hurt herself or hurt us.
And then phone the police.
And that's the only way in England to access emergency mental health care. And it's barbaric, it's inhumane, and it contributed to her psychosis. A lot of her psychosis was around being locked up in cells, and she would reimagine how it felt. It actually made her illness worse and perpetuated it. The manner in which she was arrested and physically manhandled.
Oh, God.
And then to cap it all, in order to get help in this country, you have to be at the point of hurting yourself or hurting others. And she became so ill that she was at last admitted as an NHS patient to a private hospital, where she died. And the inquest in April concluded that she died due to neglect of staff.
Eleanor has sent me a link to to your daughter's story, and that the phrase is gross failings in care amounting to neglect.
Neglect. She was neglected from beginning to end, and I mean, it's hard enough to lose a child, as those poor families will know, but to know that so little was done to help her. And I have to say that in the NHS we met some very well-meaning, a particularly wonderful doctor in Salisbury who had a team of people who genuinely cared about her. I haven't mentioned she was a mental health nurse.
That was her job.
Yeah. And she trained with some of the people who ended up caring for her on the wards, who were absolutely wonderful. But there's just, once you're discharged, that's it. You're left to your own devices. And mental health is just such a complex problem.
And obviously some of these things have got worse as a consequence of funding and cuts.
Absolutely.
Particularly that notion of having to be almost at the point of no return before you even get an intervention from the system.
Exactly the story, that you have to be at the point of complete and utter crisis before anything's done. And then the police are the answer, and that can't be right.
And the police don't want to be doing that. I have the number of police officers I've spoken to who've told me that they've ended up doing jobs that would once have been done by mental health professionals is heartbreaking. May I say your daughter's name, or would you rather that I didn't?
No, you may.
So, what knowing what you know, what with regard to Lillian, what should have been done differently? What could have been done differently? Do you think?
I think the over-reliance on drugs as being the only solution, they're part of the picture, but there was she had no therapy, she had no counselling, she had no support in the community. She would often just lie in bed all day because she was nervous of becoming psychotic again, so she'd be scared to go out. And literally, other than filling her full of drugs and sending her home, there doesn't seem to be any kind of support. There was no support for us as a family to help deal with her symptoms or to help cope with the fear that we lived with all the time. To say they're non-existent is not an exaggeration. Yeah. To say that services aren't there for people struggling and their families is no exaggeration.
So it's an emergency response system rather than a treatment system, I think, from what you're telling me.
Absolutely. And the hospitalisation, in our experience, it was merely a chance to try different medications and try and find something else to stabilise her and send her home again. And it was only this final admission to a private hospital where she should have had access to all the therapies, which she did actually, that finally we thought, and she thought, her last Facebook post is just so tragic, saying, at last I'm at the place where I'm going to get the help I need, I'm going to get back on track, I'm going to travel, I'm going to live my life. And 2 months later she was dead. Because
although they may have had these programs in place, the neglect that the coroner described meant that she didn't get to benefit from them.
They had well-paid therapists in a private setting that she saw during the week, but the nursing, the level of nursing care, it was. I think there was somewhere near half the number of staff that should have been on.
So she could do harm. She could indulge in. She could engage in harmful behaviour unchecked, as it were, unchallenged.
Absolutely, and it wasn't deliberate.
I understand what you're saying.
There was nothing suicidal. She did what I think a small percentage of schizophrenic patients are prone to polydipsia, which just means drinking too much water. And it wasn't recognised by staff, and she drank gallons and gallons and gallons of water and had a seizure, a cardiac arrest, and actually was left unattended on the ward for 4.5 hours on the floor. Can I say this? The state she was in.
I'm going to warn people that it may be harrowing for them to hear, but I think that it's important that you say it.
She was lying on the floor in her own vomit, and she defecated, and they left her there because she was quiet and she wasn't a nuisance for hours. and that's how my daughter died.
What happens to you when stories like the one we're discussing today dominate the news?
You can probably hear them shaking.
Of course you are.
It's incredibly hard to hear, and I do feel such empathy for all of them, but equally for the man in question and his family.
Because you see this tragedy in a way from a perspective that other people would struggle to see. You see it from the perspective of the mentally ill man at the heart of it, who didn't get the help that he needed.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to try to read a little bit from your pen portrait of Lily, so that we leave people with that image of her rather than the one you just described. Is that all right?
Yes, please.
Okay. You wrote that Lily was beautiful, loving, generous and hilarious, that she was so carefree and fun and so full of mischief. One of her nursing colleagues described her as a fierce and progressive mental health nurse. Lily knew what good nursing care and support looked like. You honour her memory, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's coming up to 10:44. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where, as we expected, some of these stories are proving very difficult to hear, but it is important that we do. And the courage it takes for a mother like Mary to describe the empathy that she feels for the family of Valdo Callicane is extraordinary. And yet, because we have heard her account for it, because we've heard her tell her story, it makes, to me at least, it makes absolutely perfect sense. What do you do? What is it like when you know that your loved one is going to hurt themselves, most commonly, or in this case, in the case of Valdo Callicane, hurt others? And the answers that we've heard so far on the phones and in the messages, it's like an almost chronic impotence. It's like why I use those slightly clumsy analogies about anxiety dreams where you scream but nothing comes out. It's as if you know exactly what is going to happen. Or possibly not exactly, not specifically, as Greg's call reminded us, but you know there is tragedy, enormous tragedy on the horizon, and none of the people that you expect to help prevent it can or will. And ultimately do not. It's 10:45. It is 10:47 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where, like me, many of you are profoundly moved by Mary's story about her daughter Lillian. And as a consequence of her courage in telling that story, better aware now of how tragedies, very different tragedies, like the one involving Ian Coates, Barnaby Webber, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Valdo Callicane can unfold. The simple truth at the heart of it is an absence of treatment or a failure to treat or a combination of both. 10:47 is the time. Carol is in Clacton-on-Sea. Carol, what can you tell us?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
first, I'd like to say how deeply moved and how very sorry I am to all of those affected by severe mental illness,
yes,
particularly the family of Valdo and all of those whose lives have been impacted forever.
Yes.
And Mary's story was terribly moving, but unfortunately my own story is not dissimilar, but with a better outcome.
Oh. Go on.
So my son, about 18 years ago, was becoming increasingly psychotic, mainly due to his very heavy consumption of skunk and cocaine. He was 17, I think, at the time. And the really sad thing is I knew exactly what was happening. I trained as a psychiatric nurse. I'd seen it many times.
Oh, wow.
I couldn't do anything.
Why not?
Because no one would listen to me and no one would help me.
And you couldn't get through to him because he was ill?
Well, he didn't trust me. He felt that he was incredibly paranoid.
Right.
Didn't sleep. Thought people were out to get him. Rationalised that was the case. So there was no way to really get through to him that he needed some help.
Good Lord.
Along his journey, he did get some very good help, but not from the places you'd really expect it to be.
Okay.
And I think he was very badly let down by the community mental health services. And I think the only reason I can be thankful that he's alive and very well and successful today is because of a handful of people. And they weren't necessarily the people that you would think of as being the ones there to respond and support and help when an adolescent is going through a severe psychotic crisis and is dangerous to himself and to others.
How did that danger manifest itself? How did we move from paranoia to peril, as it were?
So he was stalking around the village we lived in at night with knives and threatening to get people who were talking about him. Yeah. He said he could hear them talking about him, but they were speaking in not in English, but in strange tongues.
Yes.
And he knew they were talking about him, and he said they were after him, and he needed to save himself, and he didn't admit to the knives, but I knew that he was taking them because I saw them go. Yeah. And he was first arrested and sectioned by the police when he was driving 160 miles down the A414 on the wrong side of the road.
Oh, my goodness.
And the police were amazing, and they arrested him on a 136 section, and that led to him ultimately going into hospital on a mental health section.
Right.
And he did get some help in the form of drugs.
Right.
He came out after a while, and he said, "I'm not taking those drugs. They're worse than the ones I was taking."
Oh.
And he said, "My psychiatrist said if cocaine is better than skunk, so I'll take that instead." And so off we went again. And then he got sectioned a second time. In the meantime, it caused complete havoc with my life, with my husband's life. The police had been called by him because he said my husband was going to kill him, right. And my husband had a shotgun licence because he, like as you do when you live in the country, he would go out shooting sometimes. Yeah. And he came home to find himself met by a load of armed policemen. And it was just horrendous for 2 years. It was horrendous, and we couldn't get help. So he was released from the hospital, and they said, psychiatric services will be in touch and they'll keep a very close eye on him. And I phoned and said he's not taking his drugs. Well, Don't worry, we'll send the team round. I never saw anyone, and I never spoke to anyone.
But this is so relevant to the story we're discussing today.
I know. And I turned off my doctor's surgery, and he said, well, he's 18 now, because he became 18 when he was in hospital. And my doctor, my family doctor, was absolutely amazing.
Wow.
He actually he said he can come and see me every Friday after surgery, and I'll talk to him, because he was the only person that my son appeared to trust, and he really wouldn't talk to anybody at all, apart from one neighbour we had that was also an incredible support for him, and in fact eventually managed to get him into a job in his own company and kept a very close eye on him.
How amazing.
And and if it hadn't have been for my husband at the time and all that he had to put up with, my very, very supportive village and neighbours, the family doctor, I don't think he'd be here today.
That is extraordinary. So the systems that we're discussing and the systems that are under great criticism today failed you and your son, and yet the community up to and including the GP succeeded.
Yeah, they were amazing.
How long ago was this?
So this was by then 17 years ago. So,
right.
So my son now, he's just finishing his MBA. He's got a family. He wouldn't take an aspirin. He's got a beautiful house in Australia, and he lives a charmed and wonderful life. He has therapy. He pays for that himself. He wouldn't touch a drug, and is a fantastic father. So we're so lucky. It could have been
you're a
so
grandma.
Different. Yeah.
And is he still medicated? Does he still take medicine for his?
No. And I begged him to take them, and I said, look, you're so much better now. You're not hearing the voices. You're not hearing people talking about you. You're not feeling persecuted. You don't want to go out and harm yourself or anyone else. Don't you want to be like that. And he said, you take one of these tablets, then I dare you. So I took one, and I didn't move for 2 days.
Obviously, I have to now remind everybody not to ever engage in this sort of behaviour or undertake this kind of experiment. But it's part of your story, and for you, when he got off the drugs, the psychosis retreated for you.
Yeah.
And it was the intervention of the doctor and the neighbour that he trusted that allowed him to sort himself out. What an extraordinary story.
Yeah, with a good ending, but it could have been so different. And we were lucky, I guess. He was lucky.
Carol, thank you. I'm glad actually that it has a happy ending. Never mind a happier ending than the other stories that we've heard. Of course I am, and yet, as you acknowledge yourself, it could so easily have gone so differently because of the failure of the systems that are in place. And I wonder whether even now, 17 years later, whether the GP would have had the time and the space to engage in the kind of treatment and the kind of off the books almost attention that he was able to give to your son. Thank you. 10:55 is the time. Bilal is in Luton. Bilal, what made you pick up the phone this morning?
James, just listening to the callers, and just it brought back so much of what we went through as a family over the last, decade, more than that, 15 years. My younger brother passed away 3 years ago.
I'm sorry.
As a result of the severe side effects of the medication to treat his psychosis.
Right.
He developed a mental health issue when he was around 15, I think.
Right.
And it just progressively got worse. But he was one of those people who didn't understand that he had a problem.
Yeah.
He felt like everyone else around him was the problem. And, we were the ones who were out to get him as such. And he was fine. So to make him take medication was very, very difficult.
Right.
But the medication itself, it was like a tranquilizer.
Yeah,
it made him feel worse.
Carol just said, isn't it?
It made him feel groggy. It made him feel depressed. So he was completely against taking it. So my mum, who was essentially his full-time carer, she struggled every single day to keep him
safe.
From flaring up. Yeah, safe. And the thing with him was his outbursts were confined to the home.
Right.
Never outside.
Okay.
So if you speak to anyone that knew of him, like, the local shopkeepers, and he had a great affinity with people, in fact, who were on the streets, like begging for money, homeless people.
Yeah.
And they'd know him, and all the shopkeepers knew him. They'd comment on how nice and friendly he was, and how gentle he was with them. But his outbursts were literally confined to the home, and it was very, very difficult. The home life was incredibly difficult because of the sort of huge outbursts, day and night.
Did you try to get help? Did you try to get help for him?
Yes, constantly, but there just wasn't a clear path or a clear strategy to try and help him, because the only thing that they could give him was these tablets. They tried different tablets. Some tablets would not be as severe as others. He'd even had injections at some point to minimize the trips he'd have to take. We'd have to bribe him to take medication because he felt there was nothing wrong, and we were forcing him to take. And the life he led was basically completely non-productive, because he couldn't get a job. He couldn't sort of function while he was on medication. But when he was off medication, he'd relapse and become very paranoid. So it was a vicious circle. There was no. We felt like we were between a rock and a hard place. Do we give him the medication which we know was giving him severe side effects, making him put on an incredible amount of weight, making him depressed, or do we take him off and then he has paranoid schizophrenic type delusions and relapses and could hurt someone in the house. It was very difficult. We just didn't know where to turn to, and there was no answer. There was no
that's the point,
holistic.
isn't it?
Yeah, there was no like sort of holistic therapy or no kind of help that we felt was actually giving him a solution.
Did you? I'm going to use the word "no," Bilal, instead of the word fear. But did you know how it was going to end? Did you kind of?
Well, the side effects of the medication he was taking was making him abuse himself.
Right.
So with food and cigarettes,
right.
And he used to eat so much. Like he knew it was bad for him, so he'd go for days without eating, and then he'd binge. And the effect that had was he couldn't sleep, so he was in a severe sort of. He
was in hell, wasn't he?
He was in hell, and then he'd be dozing off, sitting on a chair, and then when he dozed off, he couldn't breathe. I took him to hospital 3 years ago at night, and I said to the team, I said, look, he's on medication, he suffers from psychosis, he cannot breathe, he's severely overweight, he's dozing off because he's severely, sleep deprived.
Yeah. Please
help him. And they said, yeah, okay, we'll help him. I was there with him for a few hours. I left him there, came home. They discharged him that night, and that night he didn't wake up.
I'm sorry, mate. You did your best, you know that, don't you?
I don't know.
Yeah, you did. I can tell from the way you tell the story that you did. You're still trying to solve the mystery. You're still trying to unravel the riddle now, aren't you? In your own head.
I kind of feel like I could have done a bit more for him.
I don't see how. I don't see how.
He was such a, gentle soul for everyone around him on the outside. People. I remember the memory I've had of him is I had him in my car once, and he said to me, "Stop the car." And I stopped the car, and there was a homeless person on the pavement, and he ran the window down and he called him over to the car, and he just started talking to him, and just being really kind and empathetic towards him, and me being his older brother to try and protect him. I just told him off, and I said to him, "What are you doing? That guy might be on drugs. He might make you do something." And he said to me, "You don't understand. You don't understand what these people go through. I know what they go through." And
how extraordinary!
That's the person he was, and he just unfortunately suffered from something he couldn't control, and there just unfortunately wasn't a support system or any path that we could see that could, just get him out of that problem.
Well, you've honoured his memory with that story, and of course with the broader story as well of the tragedy that your family still deals with, still has to deal with. Bilal, take care. Thank you. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. We'll return to this sort of territory. Tragically, I think we'll probably return to it when we're contemplating another story like this one. But I think important to leave you with the names of the people who were killed: Ian Coates, Barnaby Webber, and Grace O'Malley Kumar. But of course, what Bilal and others remind us of is that people who've died as a consequence of their own actions or their own illnesses also leave enormous holes in the lives of their families. In the next hour, we will be talking about something considerably less harrowing. Thankfully, I think I'll add at the end of that. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Thank you for all your kind words, particularly for the people courageous enough to ring in the last hour with their stories, all but Carol's being incredibly difficult tales to tell. And now we move into completely different territory. We move into territory that I find enduringly and eternally fascinating. The politics, the language of inequality. Listen, I sometimes wonder whether I need to give you a bit of a heads up on my own personal interest in things, because two traps that radio presenters can fall into. The first is thinking that you're really paying attention to what I'm saying. So rather than just having a little bit of a burble going on in the background, or you zoning in and out of doing something less boring instead, and then harking to what I'm blabbering on about in the margins, in the moment. So, and the second thing is to think that you listen all the time. And all of the data tells us, A, that you don't listen all the time. The idea that you tune in at 10 o'clock every morning and stay with me until 1 o'clock and hang on my every word in the interim is obviously bonkers. I guess maybe the podcast or the YouTube thing, the numbers for YouTube last week were absolutely extraordinary, by the way. I tell you some of the, shall we say, rather more heavily promoted programs that we do better than on YouTube. I don't think you'd believe me. I'll tell you some later this hour, I think, just to cause a bit of mischief in the building. The point being, of course, that you're not hanging on my every word. So you don't know, perhaps, as much about me as I think you do, even though I have my mother's habit of oversharing terribly. So you may not know that I went to a very posh school. You may not know that my interest in inequality is partly born, I believe, of being adopted. So I've got this weird sort of duality that you probably don't have, where I've always in life wondered what my life would have been like if it wasn't for that extraordinary junction that I encountered at the age of 28 days. What's the Robert Frost poem altogether now? Two roads diverged. Is it two roads or two paths? You're the English graduate. Is it two roads or two paths that diverged in a wood? And I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. It's not quite what Robert Frost was writing about, but two paths diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by. Did you know that, or did you just look it up, or did you just give me completely invented information? All right, anyway, it doesn't matter. Path, road, path. Hey, tomato. And because you're adopted, you kind of think, well, what if? And in my case, it would be, what if I had been raised by a single teenage mother in rural Ireland? How different would my life have been? How different would I be today? I mean, bits of me would be the same. What are the bits of me that would be the same? And what are the bits of me that have been forged and framed by my magnificent mum and dad and the opportunities that they gave me, and the negatives and the positives of my very privileged education? So I'm really interested in the dichotomy, the duality. Ross says, I reckon you'd have been a cabbie. Well, I would have been one way to exercise my mouth muscles, certainly, and to meet lots and lots of different people on a daily basis. I used to say that to Cal. I say, we got the same job, really. You never know who's going to get in the back of your cab next. You never know. But the difference, of course, between this job and being a cabbie is that you can't really come on and not say anything. You can't really ring in and say, could you just be quiet, please? I'm trying to concentrate. So apart from that, we've got an awful lot. We've got an awful lot in common. And now I'm getting all the messages that refute the idea that you don't listen religiously between 10 and 1 and hang upon my every syllable. I was generalising, all right? If you do, I'm very grateful. You're my favourites. But that's why I'm fascinated by inequality, by difference, by privilege, by what would you have been if you had had that education or that upbringing. If you'd been in that family as opposed to your family, would you have been a different person? Where would you be in the world? I'm not going to embarrass anybody, but some of the friends I've made since doing this job are among the brightest people that I know, listeners who've become good friends, all of whom work in sectors that are not where they'd be working if they'd gone to a school like mine. So brilliant people who I know for a fact that would be lawyers or FTSE 100 if they'd gone to a school like mine, because those were the expectations of going to a school like mine. But what intrigues me today with Bridget Phillipson's warnings of massive inequality in education as we brace ourselves for this week's A-level results, there's a big north-south one which I'm not across and don't fully understand, and we may get onto that this hour, although I have to tell you that Neil Basu is joining us at 12:45, former lead on counter-terrorism, who will have many interesting things to say about recent events. So we may not have time to get on to the north-south bit. There's an 8% gap between A-star and A grades in the southeast compared to A-star and A grades in the northeast. It's gone up since 2019. And if you want to compare private schools to state schools, then it's double. Pupils in private schools are twice as likely to achieve top grades as those in the state sector. And although elements of that are quite easy to unpick, the bit I'm really interested by as I get older is the inability of people on either side of privilege to see the other side. There's a sort of consciousness of the gulf and when it kicks in. So if, for example, you get to university and you encounter privately educated people for the first time, the privately educated people that you're encountering will have no idea how out of the ordinary you find them. It doesn't cross their mind because all we've ever known are people like us, people at schools like ours. It's a little bit different for me because I grew up in Kidderminster. I didn't grew up on a normal street in Kidderminster where no one had a moat, although I went to school with people who had moats around their home. So I'm interested in what it looks like from the normal side of the street. When we were talking about Labour's plans to abolish the VAT exemptions, I was very struck by the complacency of a lot of parents that send their children privately. The idea that, well, we work very hard. This incredible arrogance attached to that simple statement. I've never heard a phone-in about private education that doesn't involve a parent of a privately educated child. So, well, we work bloody hard. As if the parents of people who could never dream of sending their children to private school don't work very, very hard. As if it's just everyone could send their child to Eton if only they did a Norman Tebbit and got on their bike. So that element of it leads me into this area of interest where I just don't know what it looks like from the outside. Well, I think I do, but I don't think many people know what it looks like from the outside. If you're on the inside, you don't know what it looks like from the outside. And that's what I want to talk about. What does inequality look like? 0345 6060 973, particularly with regard to schooling. So the example I use, which is comical, is that the school I went to had an 18-hole golf course and a pack of bloody beagles. Oddly, I'd not thought about this for years, but it popped up a couple of months ago, and it keeps beagles, a pack of hounds. Is that at your school? Some schools have to do collections and fundraising rounds to buy a minibus. My school had a pack of hounds. Someone rang in, didn't they, who knew about that. I'm still not entirely sure what you do with the hounds, but you sort of follow them around the countryside or something. But that's in a way, that's what I'm talking about. The sport that I always think of is lacrosse, which is mostly played at girls' schools, I think, more than boys' schools, which is odd given its origins. And I think in America it may be different. But lacrosse is such an exotic sport. It's sort of... So do you see what I mean? What does it look like from the other side of the of the inequality divide? What does it look like? So when Bridget Phillipson talks in quite dry terms about statistics, I want to talk about vibes almost. I want to talk about life, about experiences that describe the inequalities that are baked into England's education system. What do they look like? So that the first time you encountered somebody who'd been to public school, you couldn't believe that ... 0345 6060 973. Hard not to feel intimidated sometimes, possibly inadequate. You shouldn't, because this is all purchased privilege. It's all paid for. It's baked in. But those of us who've enjoyed it often don't put in the effort needed to work out what it looks like. And that's how parents can end up saying, well, I work very hard to send my child to this. What are you telling that coal miner over there? Or that he doesn't work hard? So what does it look? What is it? Describe it. What is baked in? What are the inequalities that are baked in to our education system? What is it? What does it look like from the side of the fence that is not enjoying the privilege? Point to silly things if you want, little things, or massive institutional things. Just describe it. Let's knit a tapestry that we can look at together and know what baked in inequality looks like. All right? 0345 6060 973. It's possible I do it. It's possible you listen to me talking about things that I don't feel are remarkable, but you think, God, he's got no idea, has he? What a rarefied existence he leads or has led, or what a rarefied childhood that he had. This is quite nice from Ken. We played lacrosse at my comprehensive school, but only for one term. It was cancelled because we were too violent. John tells me we had a beehive and a Stevenson screen. So we had an 18-hole golf course and a pack of beagles, and John had a beehive and a Stevenson screen, but they look the same. That could be dangerous, couldn't it? If you're going off to measure the rainfall and you stick your hand into a box full of bees. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Just describe it. Describe it to a privileged denier. A Jacob Rees-Mogg or whatever it is, people who were born 17-0 up and think they scored every single goal. What does life look like from your end of the pitch? 0345 6060 973. It is 21 minutes after 11, and it is not uniquely British, but it is, a very English condition, isn't it? Knowing your place, doffing your cap, tugging your forelock, thinking that people who talk posh are somehow better than people what don't. And parents like mine invest huge sums of money that they often can't afford in order to imbue their children with the patina. How do you pronounce that word? Patina? I never know. And that's something I used to be embarrassed about, not knowing how to pronounce certain words. I got to my school, I said anchovy instead of anchovy, and it followed me around for about 6 months, that little misspeak. I'd never come across an anchovy before. I saw the word written down, said anchovy. There's a phrase for it, I discovered, and it should be something you're proud of, because it shows that you read widely. You read so widely that you encounter words that you don't hear ever or commonly, and therefore you don't have the guidance on pronunciation. And then the upper classes actually try to exclude you from their worlds by pronouncing words in completely absurd ways. Often their own names, like Chumley, which is pronounced Cholmondley, or Beecham, Beauchamp, which is spelled Beauchamp. There are terrible, myriad examples. So that's the point. It's not just baked in; it's deliberately baked in. But what does it look like? What does it look like? Kieran's in Hitchin. Kieran, what would you like to say?
Hey, James, lovely to speak to. Surreal experience.
Likewise.
I kind of just, when I heard about your pack of beagles at school, I sort of had to cleanse my palate for a second and realise the differences we grew up in.
Yes.
I grew up in Bradford in West Yorkshire, and I was brought up by a single mum.
Right.
We had like a few abusive people in the family at certain times, which was never helpful at school, but was also very prominent in my area, as I suppose it is everywhere nowadays. And I was expected A's and A stars all the way through my education. And when it got to my options period, year 10 and 11, I ended up getting B's and C's. I was kicked out of certain options because I wasn't intermingling well with the education system anymore at that point, because I'd stopped believing that I could get where I wanted to go by that point. I had people...
So you've got a kind of what's the point mentality kicking in, whether consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah, and I love education. I love school. I've only recently become politically engaged about a year ago, but I listen to your show all the time now, and I just feel like I really missed out on a huge portion of the education system because we weren't shown any routes we could go down. I'd never heard of the FTSE 100. I didn't know how to become a lawyer. I didn't know that there were enough jobs. There were jobs in the government for people like me. Like, I'd never heard of Angela Rayner. The only sort of engagement I had with politicism was Jo Cox. I knew Jo Cox personally.
Did you?
Because she was the Batley and Spen MP. She did a lot of funding for my sports groups and stuff. I've kind of lost my point.
You're making your point brilliantly. So when did you realise that there was because I'm fascinated by parallel universes, as you know, if you listen to the show. The idea that we might live in the same country, but we often don't live in the same world. When did you realise what the other worlds were like? When did you sort of think, crikey, that person grew up in a world that's nothing like mine?
So I ended up doing what some would call a Mickey Mouse degree. I did musical.
That's the next hour. That's the next hour, Kieran.
sorry, I was getting ahead of myself.
No, I don't think musical theatre is a Mickey Mouse degree, but I understand it's not what you call rigorously academic, perhaps.
Yeah, it's definitely not what people who want to earn money go into. And obviously, musical theatre and that whole industry is very prominently done by wealthy people. And once I went to university, I joined a school which was full of wealthy people who had been to private schools before me, or even had lived in different areas to me. There was not one person from Yorkshire in my school. There were a few people.
Well, there
from
might have been, but you wouldn't have known. They might have been from Yorkshire, but you wouldn't have known from their accent that they were.
Yeah, they would have had the accent worked out of them when they were young. Yeah. And socially I think social instances were the most difficult to navigate as someone who hadn't experienced money growing up, because you do really put yourself in this sort of one small space of this Venn diagram where you can't understand what people are talking about. Like you said about the words being different, it's not just words being said differently. The whole universe is upside down when you start meeting people with money. Like, my mum would miss meals and sometimes so that I could eat. And so hearing about people going on 4 or 5 holidays a year and having these townhouses back home and stuff, it makes you feel alienated, and it makes you feel like you don't deserve to be in the places that they are. Or maybe not deserve, but it makes you feel... It just makes you feel less than in some ways, yeah.
And because for them it's unquestioningly normal. That adds to the sense that the problem is at your end of this inequality rather than at their end. Yeah,
because I every person I've met with wealth, obvious wealth, has never acted towards be like, I am a poor person. Right. And I don't come across like a rich person, but I definitely come across working class. And there's never been a sense of pushing me away there. It's always been inside of me, a lack of confidence, a lack of belonging around these people, and it doesn't help with networking and stuff like that, which is such an important tool in an industry like mine.
It is. It's not just money, is it? Though I know you know this. It's because if you won the lottery tomorrow, you'd still notice that it's the thing about the absolute ordinariness of this that I'm fascinated by, and I think you are as well. Because what would they know about your life if you said to one of these perfectly pleasant people that your mum used to skip meals because
I imagine it'd be horror.
Well, and that would be as utterly alien to them as the idea of a school having a pack of beagles is to you. Wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And yet, I guess that and that means that achievement and status is why you read that pupils at private schools are twice as likely to achieve top grades as those in the state sector. A large part of that will be because of what you've just nailed. It will be because they believe that if they do, then the world is their oyster. Whereas you sort of came to a point where you just thought, well, even if I got those, I'm not, where am I going to go? What am I going to do with them? How are you getting on now? How are you getting? What are you doing in Hitchin?
I am now just auditioning as much as I can, really, trying to make some proper money in the TV world, which is nigh on impossible. But
you're giving it. You are pursuing your dreams.
Yeah, absolutely.
We wish you the very, very, very best. We really do. And beautifully put. I mean, truly beautifully put. And, I'm reading actually about maintenance grants being abolished in 2016, which makes Kieran's experience rarer than it was when I was younger or when you were younger, because the people from the poorest backgrounds, since the Tories cut the maintenance grant for the poorer students, will have put more and more people off going into higher education. And oddly, I know a little bit about theatre and musical theatre. And because I did youth theatre as a youngster, and I was the freak when I went to youth theatre. That's why it was such a healthy experience for me. I was the freak. I shouldn't really go to a school like mine. Everybody is a bit like you. But outside of a school like mine, where all you have in common is an interest in theatre, and some of the kids there could only spend 6 weeks in the summer in Manchester because they'd got a grant from their local council, I was like some sort of weird alien. The way I spoke. And at school, I'd sometimes get stick for not being posh. And then I'd move into other environments where I'd get stick for being a cross between sort of Brideshead Revisited and I don't know. We didn't know who Jacob Rees-Mogg was back then, thankfully, but that's how I would appear to say. It's crazy, right? This whole system. What a brilliant first call. Thank you, Kieran. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. I tell you what also fascinates me, listening to Kieran a moment ago, is accents and the decision at some point to talk in the way that you talk, because I think we all do it subconsciously. I don't sound that posh, right? And yet, when I was 13 or 14, I think I did. And I remember bumping into a lad who used to get so much jip at school for saying grass instead of grass. And he was from the northwest. He was from the Wirral, and I bumped into him a couple of years after leaving. He was older than me, so he'd probably already halfway through university. I bumped into him on the King's Road in Chelsea, and he sounded like Tim Nicebut-Dim. And he used to get jip at school for having a sort of very slight northwest accent, vaguely Liverpudlian accent, just the grass thing. My school, they're called Mass. You're going to church on a Sunday, it was called Mass. Mass. I've never met anyone who didn't go to my school who calls it Mass. What story do I usually tell now about my dad for people who do pay proper attention to the prayer? Would you like some toast? Pardon? Would you like some toast? I'll have some if you're having some. So this is where my dad dropped me off at my first prep school. And the headmistress, no, the headmaster's wife invited him for breakfast or come and have a cup of tea. And he's having a cup of tea and she says, would you like some toast? I had no idea what she's talking about. Genuinely no idea. You sort of, what? What? And so then he said, I'll have some if you're having some. She said, right, I'll put in 2 slices then. Toast? Who says toast? Would you like a slice of toast? So what intrigues me is, because I don't know if you do it. I notice, looking back now, I know when I started trying to sound less posh than I sounded naturally, and it was in 1988 in Doncaster. Only 2 weeks working on a building site, and then subsequently off to Manchester to do the youth theatre the same summer. And I think I remember trying to sound a bit less posh. I couldn't put on a Doncaster accent, but I think I started trying to sound a bit Mockney. Do you remember when Mockney was a really big thing? Guy Ritchie and Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, everyone trying to sound like the Lost Mitchell brother, even if they'd been to Eton. I think I started going down that road in about 1988. But other people go in entirely the opposite direction. Quite a lot of Tory MPs have got no business sounding like they've got plums in their mouths. If you look at their backgrounds, their education, their location growing up, but they've deliberately chosen to talk like that because they know that it opens certain doors. It gives you kudos in certain circles. You all thought you were going to get the Maury Canby story. That's not a conversation about the way that you talk. That's a conversation about where you go on holiday. 11:36 is the time. Janine's in Penge. Janine, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, Janine. Would you like some toast?
Good, thanks. I wanted to talk about my little boy's in private school.
Yes.
And his dad was privately educated, but I was absolutely not. Quite the opposite. So I grew up in South Wales. And went to school in a school where I think part of it had been burned down at one point, so we were educated in porter cabins with a leaky roof.
Yes.
And the occasional teacher. So
the last bit counts. The occasional teacher bit is relevant because there are some private schools that have pretty run-down facilities, but they also have an 18-hole golf course and a pack of beagles. So it's a funny old world. Carry on.
They do. So my little one, he's in a private school, and I think the difficulty I have is how do I balance him having all of the wonderful things that go with it, but also understanding it's actually not very normal, and his education is just far superior to others.
And he's got no idea. And I mean,
he doesn't. Why would he?
Yeah. What shocked you? What are the things that you think, how the heck? Well, I didn't even know that was available at schools.
So it's a daily shock, I think. So I think even talking to the teachers and the first chat we ever had with them, and they were saying, in Michaelmas we do this, and I'm sat there going, in Michael what? My partner's nodding away, and they just use some of these terms where I'm Googling Michaelmas and trying to understand what these things are.
Yeah.
So
do you think that's deliberate? Do you think that is exclusionary?
I've talked to them actually, and they've been incredibly open to that chat about how it felt for me. I don't think many people call it out because maybe they're part of it. For them, they wouldn't think to say, maybe not everybody understands you, because they perfectly understand. So I'm aware of that as well. They have listened when I've said, look, my first session with you all, I was sat there thinking, I don't know what you're talking about.
Wow.
But my little boy's clubs, he's 7 years old. The clubs that we have on offer when he starts in September during lunch hour are things like philosophy, debating, card games and board games. But he can also do animation. So they have a filmmaking class that he can join.
Yeah.
And I remember doing, media and things like that at GCSE. We wouldn't have had equipment to do anything, even at that level, let alone at 7, doing it for pure fun.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, your perspective is really powerful because you're simultaneously aware of the absurdity, but also the value. Because who wouldn't want this for their child?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Do you talk to your husband about it much? Because for him, this is normal, right? And for you, it's extraordinary. For you, it's utterly abnormal.
He thinks I think he looks at it. Look at me. His parents were they run their own pub,
right,
and paid for school, and they grafted, and he saw that. He saw that it wasn't easy. But as much as he saw that, and the pub probably helped him, his school environment was just stunning. And he was the poorest person in his class, and I think he kind of thinks, that wasn't particularly easy. But he's still the poorest person in this class where they, an hour from going into fencing for the day. So
I did fencing? I forgot about that. I did fencing.
Exactly. I'll say to him sometimes, oh, boo, and you had to do fencing. It's just
for people listening, this is sword fighting, not putting up a fence. That's a very that would be a lot more bloody use in life to have been taught the other sort of fencing.
Exactly. I was thinking, oh, wonderful, some skills you can put. No, it's not that at all. It's poking sticks at each other.
Yes, it is. And I'm glad that we're laughing, but the serious subtext to this is worrying, not yet because he's 7, but worrying that he won't know. It's because when I speak to the parents who say, well, I work bloody hard, it's the denial of luck. It's the denial of serendipity. Even if you were the poorest in the class, you still acknowledge that you're being gifted something of enormous value that is largely down to luck. Inherited luck or the family tree luck. And that's the thing that I think we all worry about, is making sure our children can simultaneously benefit from this unfair privilege, but also understand A, the unfairness of it, and B, the absolute serendipity.
Yeah, one of our neighbours are incredible people, and they have a child a little older than ours. And they work so hard, and they want to do everything they can for him. They're so committed to him. They help, education-wise. They help with him sports-wise, and they don't. We do not work any harder than them, but they could never do it. It's just not possible. And you look and think, gosh, I look at their little boy and think, if he had what my little one has, it's quite incredible to imagine where he would be. I mean, he's doing really, really well, but that he just doesn't have the same chances.
I wonder whether it'd be interesting to catch up in a few years and whether, we still think that, or we have to start trying to convince ourselves that things that we've achieved or things that our children have achieved are down entirely to their innate skills and abilities and some forms of superiorities. I love that phrase about being born 3-0 up and thinking you've scored a hat-trick, because it describes it perfectly. I think having a mum like you, Janine, he's going to be absolutely fine. He's going to have a full grasp of the complexities of privilege, the complexities of class. It is 11:42. Fencing. I mean, how mad is that? Fencing, right? Well, I mean, a 7-year-old doing animation or having a philosophy class during So that's why I'm so fascinated by it, because when you benefit from it, people like Janine and I are quite rare. Is you just think it's normal or deserved or earned. And yet if you're on the other side of the fence, what do you think, Kieran, hearing about 7-year-olds having philosophy classes? It's up there with a Beagle Pack. It's not snobbish to say so. It's the opposite. It's actually recognising how different the country would be, the world would be, if there was more equality of opportunity. You can't have equality of outcome, and you can't have equality of origin. Private tuition, whether you go to private school or not, is a game changer. But the more equality of opportunity you have, the more meritocratic your society becomes. And I think often that we're moving in the opposite direction from that. I really do. John's in Portsmouth. John, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Yeah, thanks for having me on. First-time caller.
Welcome.
Yeah, I think the duality conversation is a good one rather than kind of trying to damn people where they come from, which I certainly don't resent. People who have had that kind of education. But
it'd be a bit hypocritical if I did, wouldn't it?
well, indeed. We grew up in a kind of house of duality, if you like. My father left school at 14, worked on the railways. My mum's father, however, was also from a poor background, but got a free scholarship to a posh school. So we grew up in a household where there was some experience of that, and therefore some aspiration to do better, if that's the right word. I'm not sure it is. And my brother and sister both went to university, which was quite unusual growing up in Plymouth, which is not the most well-heeled town.
Sure.
And I went to a state grammar school, which had aspirations. It tried to do fencing, but was rubbish. Tried to play rugby, but lost against all the posh schools. So we kind of lived in that kind of
hinterland
world where, the posh schools looked down on us, and the rough kids came around to try and beat us up every year. So
it's that John Cleese sketch, isn't it? I look down on him, and he looks down on me, and all of that. So you had a constant consciousness, really, of the strata of society.
Definitely. My dad, had a broad West Country accent, but was aware where he came from, and I always felt he was trying to aspire to what his father-in-law would have expected. And then professionally and with my own kids went to state school. But when we moved to the southeast, my younger one, who was quite talented, wanted to play rugby, but all the rugby tours were arranged around the posh schools' holidays, so he couldn't go on any of them because he was still at school.
Oh, gosh, little things like that. That would never have crossed my mind, but that extra week you get, breaking up a week early, that's when they go on tour, and your boy can't because he's still at school.
Yeah, you turn up at the matches, there's a certain set dressed in the mustard cords and all that kind of stuff.
Where do you buy those?
I don't know.
The plum ones as well. They're like the sort of red cords. I don't know. There must be a special shop somewhere where you can go and buy that stuff. And actually, you remind me of the Olympics. I was looking at some of the statistics regarding medals in the Olympics and how disproportionately represented private schools are. It's hardly a bloody mystery, is it? If you've got fencing classes. Well, exactly that. John, you've taken me up to the wire, and I've got to come out on time for once because Neil Basu, the former Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police and a former head of counter-terrorism policing for the UK, is joining us shortly after this to discuss, among other things, recent events and possible root causes behind them. The time now is 11:46. It is 11:48. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Neil Basu, QPM, recipient of the Queen's Police Medal, is a former Assistant Commissioner in the Met and former head of counter-terrorism policing for the UK. Also, I think the first guest that we've booked on this programme to discuss recent events on the streets of this country, and clearly a man supremely qualified to do so. Let's begin with some comments, if we may, Neil, from the Home Secretary yesterday that I haven't heard you respond to yet. The idea that the British public have lost respect for the police, that this current malaise extends beyond the explosions of violence or the expressions of unhappiness and runs much deeper. Is that something you recognise?
Yeah, well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And there was a bit of a perfect storm. I mean, this arrived at a terrible time for policing, where since Robert Peel set up modern policing in 1829, it's been founded on trust and confidence, which gives us the consent to police the public. You can't police 70 million people with 140,000 cops unless they consent to it. If you lose that consent, you're in desperate trouble. And of course, all of this probably 2 years ago, just on the cusp of my retirement, trust and confidence had reached an all-time low in policing as a profession. And not only had we lost the confidence of the Black and Asian community, which we hadn't had for many, many years, in my opinion. We'd lost the confidence of women and girls, LGBTQ+. And what we've probably seen over the last 2 weeks is a loss of confidence with certain elements of the white working class. And arguably, we've never had the confidence of youth either. If you add all of those different sectors of society together, you get the majority of the public, and that is a loss of consent in the policing model. So the two things, I don't think were connected, but nevertheless, it was the perfect storm, the worst time for something like this to happen to policing.
Well, I wonder whether there are very different routes, though, to the various constituencies you've just described, because the loss of confidence from women and girls in particular would trace back to Sarah Everard's murder and other notorious cases of police officers being the opposite of what we expect them to be. Ethnic minorities, whether through stop and search or historically disproportionate instances of death in custody, and the natures of investigation or drug inquiries. These are arguably fact-based grievances, and yet when you have public figures saying that the police are possibly keeping information from the public, if elements of the public then get very angry and violent about something that's a lie, or at the very least a deliberately dangerous speculation, that's not a fact-based loss of confidence. So you probably can't, the remedy can't be the same for both diseases, can it?
No, and I think that's a brilliant analysis, by the way. But your original comment, where I lecture a lot on diversity, I was the highest ranking officer of colour when I retired, only the fourth to reach my rank since 1829. I know quite a lot about racism and inclusion and diversity practice and what it takes to be a leader in those kind of environments. And I talk about that a lot. But racism, I talk about because I know a lot about it. I'm in my 57th year. I'm a little bit older than you, James. But I've, since my first conscious memory, I've understood and dealt with racism since I was about 3 or 4 years old. But all of those different classes, the fact-based grievances that lead to, they're very different journeys. They're very different journeys, but they have very similar outcomes. The othering that happens in society. And what policing has done poorly for many years, and I'm one of policing's greatest critics because I love it. I absolutely love the profession. I think I've earned the right to criticise it. But it has, generally speaking, over-policed and under-protected those communities. Now, the difficulty, and your analysis was spot on, this was not a fact-based grievance. This was a lie that was made up. But if you don't have the confidence in the police, if you don't have the confidence in the state, if you don't have the confidence in society, which has been going downhill since the 1960s, you're going to get this kind of explosion of a response because there's no other outlet for it. And of course, when I say confidence in the police, what I want criminals, and basically that is what we have seen a great deal of, these are criminals, not protesters, not demonstrators, criminals. They don't have the confidence that they're going to get caught. People keep talking about deterrent sentences, but they don't have confidence that basically policing is any good. So they think, well, okay, I can take liberties because no one's going to catch me and no one's going to put me before the courts. And these people don't think of the consequences of their actions. They don't even think they're going to get sentenced. Sentences aren't the deterrent. Catching people quickly is the deterrent.
At what point do those criminals become terrorists, in your view?
There were two specific occasions, and I talked about this in the week that it happened. By the way, I haven't said the obvious thing is, and I feel complicit in this as well.
Why?
We all hijacked 13 families' bereavement and grief. And we should never have been in that position to be talking about this. We should have been talking about how we support those families and the community they came from. And you saw, the greatest thing I saw in that first week was a community coming together to support, to say not in my name, and to support those families. And that was straight after a group of white thugs surrounded a mosque and tried to burn it down with, worshippers inside it who were clearly absolutely terrified. That crossed a legal definition for terrorism for me. The difficulty is you've got to prove what the ideology was. And if the ideology was anti-Muslim hatred, I want to make Muslims live in fear and I want to get rid of them and potentially I want to kill them, it crossed that line easily. And you saw something similar in Rotherham when it extended UK-wide, where they surrounded a hotel, which was an asylum seekers refuge, and tried to do exactly the same thing. And I was very grateful that the new Director of Public Prosecutions, a lot of people scoffed at what I was saying. And I was saying, there was a lot of stuff about two-tier policing. I'm sure you'd want to discuss that. You can't have a two-tier approach to terrorism. Try and think about the pressure that would have been put on policing and the government if a group of Muslims or a group of black men had surrounded a white church and tried to burn it down with worshippers inside. No one would have hesitated for a single second to call that terrorism. And I know that. I did counter-terrorism for 7 years.
What do you hear then when you hear the phrase two-tier policing? When did you first hear it in the context of it somehow favouring minorities as opposed to favouring the white majority? When did you first come across it? And what do you hear, A, when you hear it, and B, when you hear politicians like Priti Patel and Nigel Farage bandying it around?
Well, I think that's the politicisation of policing. We could do a whole show on that.
Yes.
Both political and media commentary on policing has done the public no favours. Great criminologist Rob Reiner said, you'll get the police you deserve. If you want to talk about them in that way, if you want to disparage them, if you want to accelerate the loss of confidence, and don't get me wrong, policing has the first responsibility to win trust and confidence, not the other way around. But nevertheless, if you want to amplify that, you're going to get people not wanting to join, wanting to leave. You're going to get them not wanting to do their job or exercise their powers. And by the way, that's exactly what you've got today.
Yeah.
So if you speak to any of my former chief constable colleagues or the commissioner of the Met, you'll hear that is a refrain from policing today. So we can't have this catch-22 where politicians are using them as a political football to make a political point, when actually this is a law and order issue on the streets of London. And any sitting government, their first responsibility is the safety of their citizens. I'm very proud that my final operational job in policing was defending this realm. That is the government's first important duty. People think of that in terms of war and the Ministry of Defence and our military services. Well, actually, it's everyday safety on the streets, which is actually entirely the responsibility of the police service. So if you want that safety on the streets, you should be backing your police, not using them to make political points. So the two-tier thing, I'm disgusted by. That is not what policing does. Policing knows that if it does adopt a two-tier policing approach, and it has done that in the past, and the not that distant past, then it loses trust and confidence from the section of the community that feels it is hard done by. And therefore, that's the section of community that rises up. And it's ironic for a mixed-race police officer to be hearing two-tier policing in regard of we're playing favourites with the Muslim community from the white working class community, when we spent, the vast majority of the post-Windrush era over policing and under protecting minority communities. So there is a deep irony to it. But that was not the modern police service that I left. They know if they do that, they are going to bring pain on themselves. And we have politicians bringing pain on police officers who are putting their bodies on the line to keep the peace. And they are being put at risk because we are amplifying the idea that somehow they're playing favourites. They're not. That's not how public order commanders are trained. It's not what they do.
Speaking of amplification, and you'll be more cognizant than I am that some charges have been brought, but the role of social media and spreading ideas that are untrue while perhaps claiming that you're only asking questions or referring to the social media accounts of some, profoundly and provenly unsavoury people, the relationship between those interventions and the riots themselves. What if you were still in post, what approach would you be taking to the question of whether public figures have actually contributed to incitement?
I'd be calling it out. I'd probably be doing not much different than I did in the last week. In all fairness, my friend, the current Commissioner, Mark Rowley, has been doing exactly that. So also behind the scenes, I'd be asking our leading politicians to get together with their counterparts and try and get unity in the House about this is not the right thing to do. I did notice a quick flip within about 48 to 72 hours where even some of those figures who were using this to their own ends started to say, well, of course, I don't support violence. But there is a completely disingenuous tone and a shamefacedly lack of remorse that they might have contributed to the acceleration of this and the fact that it spread by making such, comments as, are we being kept in the dark? Are we not really being told the reasons? And we use these anodyne expressions, misinformation and disinformation. I like to use the word lies. Just let's make it crystal clear. People like to lie to make a point, either to make a name for themselves or in order to get supporters and more followers. And I think that kind of thing is pretty disgraceful.
Finally, Neil, the former head of MI6 Russia desk, on precisely this point, Christopher Steele said that the security service will be looking very carefully at the instigators of these activities, including people like Tommy Robinson, even conceivably Nigel Farage, who incidentally said that we were being misinformed by the government about Southport. I sense you haven't got much of a bone to pick with that position.
Not at all. I mean, I obviously used to be read into a lot of that counterintelligence information. I'm no longer read into that, but common sense will tell you that when these things happen, and they happened with some of the terrorist attacks in the UK that I dealt with, we had the amplification by proxy groups and state-sponsored cyber, effectively warehouses of people and bots that were amplifying a message which would divide a society. My great friend Jeremy Fleming said when he was editing Radio 4 a couple of years ago before he retired, said the one thing this country has to be really clear about is that the biggest threat from our adversaries overseas is not, nuclear weapons or switching off a nuclear power station or interfering with our infrastructure. It's the simple spread of lies which will divide society. He used the term disinformation. I'm using the term lies. That was the greatest threat that the head of GCHQ thought was facing us. And it has been proven. And if we don't do something with social media companies, which I tried to do when I was in my position, and the big six basically refused to meet me and my counterparts from the Five Eyes intelligence community, they agreed to meet the attorney generals. So when governments get involved, when the law becomes the law and is enforced against social media giants, and when their advertisers stop spending money with them, that's when they sit up and take notice. So you said, what else would I be doing? I'd be taking out responsible people with a big platform who shouldn't be saying the things they're saying. I'd be going after criminals who are inciting hatred online and prosecuting them. And I'd be getting the big six around the table and saying, we can either do this in partnership or we'll be legislating against you.
In that first group of people, we're talking about Nigel Farage.
I've made comments about Nigel Farage, but also two ex-Home Secretaries' comments, which are being
Priti Patel and Suella Braverman.
Yeah, they're being done for a political purpose. I mean,
so would you be wanting
the right thing to do? It's two Home Secretaries.
Farage's social media activity in particular. Do you think that should be investigated?
I imagine that my former colleagues are doing precisely that. They'll be looking at anybody who might have incited this, so they'll be looking at the timeline from minute one, and you've seen actually some arrests and prosecutions in this space about who has amplified this rhetoric and whether the lines that they were using might have had an influence. But the law is very clear. It has to be designed to incite racial hatred. It has to be published in order to incite that hatred. I mean, people are very clever. We spent years chasing Anjem Choudhury. We've done the same thing with the Axley Lennon. These people are very, very clever. They know exactly where the line of the law is, and they stay south of that line. And it isn't for police officers, serving or ex, to start changing that line. It's for elected politicians and the society they serve to decide, is this what we want in our name? Is this what we want in our name? My view on that is absolutely not, because I have had to face the real world consequences of it. And I don't just mean as a police officer. Think of all those black and Asian police officers who were having stuff thrown at them, spat on, abused, potentially hurt and hospitalized, who when they took their uniform off and went home for the evening were an equal target. You've got to understand that lawful but awful, which is the great soundbite that people were using, which was taken out of the Online Safety Act, is a problem for society, and society needs to start debating where it wants to draw that line.
We're out of time, unfortunately. Can I tempt you onto my podcast where we'll have a bit more time to sit down and find out a little bit more about your life and background as well, Neil?
I'd be absolutely delighted. I think you can tell that I like to rant.
Well, it's a date. Seriously, thank you. And thank you for your time today. Neil Basu, QPM, the former Assistant Commissioner of the Met and the former Head of Counter-Terrorism Policing for the UK. The time now is 4 minutes after 12. It's 7 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I just had a standoff. Do you want to know some inside gossip? It's a standoff outside the gender-neutral toilet that we all use here in LBC with Alexander Armstrong, who of course is on Classic FM at this moment in time. And I took the view, I got there just before him, And I took the view that I would not be polite and let him go first, because he can just go back to the studio, stick on a particularly long concerto, and then come out and use the facilities to his heart's content, whereas I have to squeeze my visits into much smaller slots. That's a slightly infelicitous turn of phrase. So I thought you might want to know a little bit of inside showbiz gossip there. Standoff outside the gender-neutral toilets. 8 minutes after 12 is the time. Change of pace now. We will almost certainly, but an awful lot of love come. Well, love's not quite the right word, but Neil Basu certainly impressed you, didn't he? And yeah, I'm glad I invited him to Full Disclosure at the end, and I'm looking forward to it almost as much as you are, or as much as you are. Rosalind says that was brilliant. Dave says what a thoughtful and insightful with an S, not a C, individual Mr. Basu is. I'm really looking forward to that Full Disclosure episode. Carol, what a fantastic interview. The retired police chief was knowledgeable, balanced, articulate, and absolutely accurate in his assessment. It's voices like him that we need to hear more of on our TV and radio, and on it goes. So we will be looking forward to that Full Disclosure. The first opportunity, while some of these issues are still sort of box fresh, still live, still current, as it were. And we will, of course, be returning to the equality-related conversations almost certainly sooner rather than later. I need to try to remember to give you the news about the podcast of the because you probably didn't know that this program is available on YouTube in glorious Technicolor, so you don't just get to hear me. I'm now looking at the camera in a boggle-eyed fashion. You also get to see me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell your friends. Is that what's the? Is it Hassan will know? Hassan's only what do you say on YouTube? Do you say don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell your friends? Is that what? And don't forget to turn your notifications on. Why? Why do you have to turn your notifications on? Yeah. Oh, so don't forget to turn your notifications on so that you get a little notification every time a new video drops. Yeah, drops. Right? It's drops. Yeah. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Do I need a name for my fans on YouTube? Like Swifties? Is that, or would that, Jimmy's? Would that just be silly? No, that would be silly. Come on, 52 years old. So, but it's the fourth most popular, I think, at the moment on the whole of YouTube, ahead of some. And remember, this is the one you can watch. So obviously, I'm not really competing in the podcast market because I'm on the radio, but you can get the podcast from Global Player. And you can watch it on YouTube. And because obviously last week's news saw a lot of people wanting to tune in. It's safe to say it's ahead of an awful lot of outfits that get rather more promotion than I do. I'm sure it won't last, but go us, I would say. The fourth most popular podcast on YouTube last week. So congratulate. No, people aren't remotely interested in this, are they? I'll stop now. But I did that for a reason. One of the reasons I did it for is because you could probably get a degree in this kind of stuff these days. So if you were to get a degree in social media, you were going to do a degree in social media, my reaction would be, oh, don't be ridiculous. But have a little think for a minute about how important it is to maximize those sort of statistics. And what do you do to maximise those sort of statistics? What did Hassan just say? Our young work experience friend. He said you've got to turn on your notifications. Now, obviously, that's not going to get you a degree, that single insight. But search engine optimization or maximising the reaction that you get online is going to be is already a huge part of how our civilization operates. So when I read in the Daily Mail that Mickey Mouse courses are advertising degrees in social media, I find myself thinking that we are revisiting territory we last visited about 15 years ago, when pompous old fools like me poo-pooed media studies. Clive tells me that it's like, subscribe, share. No, you've got to turn your notifications on, bruv. So when media studies became a thing, one of the first articles I ever got published was in a magazine that was called G-Spot, would you believe? It was very hard to find in newsagents. It was a club magazine. It was a bit like Dazed and Confused, but nowhere near as successful. Although, obviously, when my mum started boasting to her friends in Sainsbury's about the final arrival of a byline on my CV. It was potentially a slightly hazardous conversation. But the first article I got published there was about media studies degrees, and it was written from a position of negativity. It was written from a position of children being let down, and albeit that this was in the days before all funding of university interviews had been taken away, essentially being robbed and conned into staking their futures on unachievable goals. You are going to spend an awful lot of money, take out an awful lot of debt for a degree that, in the context of getting a job in the industry that you want to get a job in, is going to prove to be largely worthless. I could not have been more wrong. The incidence of individuals I work with now who haven't done some form of media training, haven't done some form of academic, haven't done a journalism qualification in particular. It doesn't necessarily have to be to degree level, but it has now replaced the old journey that my dad took, which was through regional newspapers onto Fleet Street, or the one that I took, which was through gossip columns. If you went to a posh school, you didn't have to go and work for the whole Daily Mail. You could go and work for a gossip column and not get a byline in the newspaper, work under someone else's byline, whether it was a real person or a 18th century Irish diarist called William Hickey. You would submit your little bits for that column, and if you were any good, and you'd work your way. So that the old paths to professional status have largely closed, which means that the academic training becomes more important. And that's why I'm wary of concluding that some of the degrees being described as Mickey Mouse degrees today deserve to be. But I don't know. So Daily Mail analysis of the UCAS clearing website shows 22 institutions are offering courses in video gaming or esports, social media, digital content creation, and there's one course called a Rap and MC course, MC as in Master of Ceremonies, which is also a word for crossword fans, spelled E-M-C-E-E. Did you know that? It quite often comes up on Spelling Bee. So what I want to know in the first instance is what you do on these specific courses. What do you do on a video gaming and esports degree course? 0345 6060 973. Number two, what do you do on a social media degree? Because I've got a feeling that would be quite a good thing to do. I've got a feeling that a social media degree in 2024 would be a bit like a media studies degree in 2004. You're going to be ahead of the curve. You're going to be ahead of the loop. You're going to get hired to come in and tell people like me how to improve my profile on YouTube. Don't forget to ring that bell, for example. But it can't just be that, because that's not 3 years worth of studying, is it? So do you see is it a degree? So question number one is, what do you do? And question number two is it actually a degree? And then on the Rap and MC course, if there's only one course in the country, I would also cautiously suggest that that's probably quite a good course to get onto as well, isn't it? If there's only one in the country, it's presumably quite prestigious. A great friend of mine was one of the first people to go on the pop music degree course at the place in Manchester that George Martin was involved in setting up, and he went on to be a hugely successful guitarist. So what are these specific degrees, these degrees in social media, esports and video games, and latterly, given that there's only one, we're probably not going to have anyone listening who can tell us, but you know me, we'll try. You've got digital content creation. How can that be a Mickey Mouse degree? That's the future. A digital content creation degree? No? Or, of course, finally, the Rap and MC one. And are we confident that they actually qualify as degree courses? 0345 6060 973. All right, hit those numbers now. You will get through. But I also want to talk to you if you did what was then called a Mickey Mouse degree. So you signed up for a degree in media studies or a degree in cartooning or a degree, I don't know what it was, but you know that other people thought that it was a Mickey Mouse degree. I'd like you to tell me whether they were right or wrong. Now that a few years have passed since you graduated with your so-called Mickey Mouse degree, are you in a position to throw that pejorative back in the faces of your critics? Or are you here to ruefully admit that in retrospect and upon reflection, it was probably a waste of your time and money to do what other people called a Mickey Mouse degree? So there's two ways into this. The degrees that are being called Mickey Mouse degrees today, is that fair? And the degrees that were called Mickey Mouse degrees yesterday, was that fair? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 20 minutes after 12 is the time. This is good. This is fascinating, writes this unsigned text. I run an esports and gaming company in Newcastle. We have 15 staff ranging from YouTube presenters to software developers, social media managers, short-form video editors, and esports event management. All of them gained their skills from spending their free time outside of formal education, developing the skills. If you want to give me a buzz, I'd love to know, because I don't know from that whether you think the degrees are good or not. Whether you're saying they're unnecessary because you can do it outside of formal education, or whether you're welcoming the idea that you bring them into formal education because the jobs that you describe are in many ways the jobs of the future. This one from Cole. One of my first IT jobs was for a games company. It's software development, but in a very specific area. Gaming and esports understanding can definitely get you a career. I simply tested games and learned to code while I was there, and I'm now a development manager. So I think pretty clear that that is not, that no one thinks that they are Mickey Mouse degrees. But the Daily Mail says they are. You know, we can joke about that, but remember, people's parents read the Daily Mail. You're thinking of signing up for a degree in social media or a degree in video gaming, and your parents are reading in the Daily Mail that it's a Mickey Mouse degree, you're going to have all sorts of problems at home. So what would you say at that dinner table? And finally, this is from Blake. This is really interesting. I was at Leicester DMU studying media tech when David Cameron called it useless. I don't actually remember that, but I find it very easy to believe, Blake. So many people in my cohort found it hard to get work at that time because why would you value a degree that the Prime Minister himself had insulted? I might look that story up, actually. So that's what we're trying to work out. Matthew is in Eaglescliff in County Durham. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I studied computer games design back in the year 2000.
Okay.
So
you're quite ahead of the curve with that, I'd have thought, as an academic course.
Well, it was the first of its kind in the UK, and I studied at Teesside University. So the course itself, the end of it, we ended up as a bit of a jack of all trades and a master of none, because it took this scattergun approach. So I learned a bit of animation, a bit of illustration, a bit of script writing, a bit of editing, a bit of 3D modelling.
Right.
And what you ended up coming out with was...
I know what most of those things are.
Okay. I tried not to touch on the ones that are a bit more technical.
Well, I'm very grateful to you.
Essentially, because you knew a bit of everything, you weren't good at any one particular thing unless you were particularly skilled in that area already. What happened was I left, I got a full-time job, I started a family, and the dream of working in video games slowly slipped away. But my friend, who kept a part-time job and just kept on working away on his portfolio and really grafting on those skills, actually now works in the industry for Marvel and Disney, and has had all sorts of his work shown in movies that you'll have probably seen. So the degree itself was a bit of a Mickey Mouse degree, but he managed to use it to then forge that career.
And that's partly because it was in such early days. So the degree now, 24 years later or 20 years later, has probably evolved and being honed and would be much more fit for purpose when it comes for preparing people for entry into an industry that is big and growing. And you can't say that about many industries.
No, Grand Theft Auto 5 is still the largest entertainment release in history. It's a video game that has been I think it's in the top 20 in America and has been since its release over a decade ago.
That's insane, isn't it? I was posting about my book being in the charts for 30 weeks. 10 years, man. When's the next one out? When's the next one out? The next one's out soon. It'd be interesting to see what it does.
Out early next year.
Yeah.
But the other point I wanted to make, just as a flip side to it, is is university did actually still provide me with some benefits, which I think is the independence that it brings, the people that you meet that come from much broader areas of the world even than where I grew up in Middlesbrough. So it does have benefits, even if you do have a Mickey Mouse course, so to speak. I keep on saying
I know.
Like it was a really bad thing.
But hang on, your mate ended up in cartoons, didn't he? So it's quite appropriate in a way. You mentioned your family. So how old's your oldest now?
19.
And well, you may already have had this conversation. If she told you that she was going to go to university to study any of these courses, I'll run through them: video games or esports, social media courses, digital content creation, or rap and MC course. Maybe leaving out the last one because that's going to involve a very specific set of interests.
Yeah.
What would you say? You'd be cool with that? You'd be comfortable, or would you say no?
I think I would be.
Right.
I think I would be. She actually wants to be a teacher, but my son is really into coding, and he's played video games because I love them. So his interest in them has led to what I think will be a career for him.
How interesting.
So,
and we missed a trick there. I got half the joke, Matthew, about going into cartoons, but your friend did a Mickey Mouse degree and now works for Disney. That's the gag.
I missed that as well.
How did we both miss that? That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Take care, mate. That's a perfect first call on this subject. And apparently it's fall or autumn of next year that Grand Theft Auto 6 comes out. That's going to be an interesting moment for me because my video game enthusiasm has diminished exponentially, actually, since my oldest was born. And for a period when my kids were very, very young, I was getting paid to review video games. And if you don't know the answer to this question, you're not going to believe it. Who do you think I got paid to review video games for? Including Grand Theft Auto 5, would it have been a decade? Maybe. Certainly Grand Theft Auto 4. What British media outlet? What's the least likely British media outlet that paid me to review video games, including Grand Theft Auto? You're not allowed to answer that question unless you genuinely don't know, because I have mentioned it before. But you won't believe it if you don't. Martin's in Grimsby. Martin, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Yeah, I'm in Grimsby at the moment. I work for a university in Birmingham, and I'm a course leader for a songwriting course. And for degrees, higher education. So up to kind of level 6, really. And we get a lot of MCs, rappers, people who are interested in that sort of thing. And I think these courses, they always get knocked. They always get called the kind of Mickey Mouse degrees. I know the last government, when they used to kind of periodically wheel this phrase out, I'd look up exactly what courses they mean. And there was always sort of music courses in there and stuff, you know, in favour of sort of science and maths, of course, with the last Prime Minister. Yeah. But the thing is, the point I wanted to make was that I think every higher education course, it has the name of the course, and of course you're going to do modules that are associated with those topics. But there's a whole load of other skills and you know, personal skills and life skills that come with it. So, for example, you might not, if you've got a kid on the street who's really into rap and really into making beats in his bedroom and you know, stuck in his laptop and all he wants to do is music, he wouldn't go do another degree, I don't think. You know,
so he either does no degree or this degree.
Yeah, he does this degree, but along with it, the other side of it, yes, he's going to learn about rap, he's going to learn about MCing, he's going to learn about writing songs and all the things that student's going to love. But also, they're going to come out with presentation skills. They're going to be given presentations, standing up in front of people, learning how to articulate their thoughts. They're going to do the whole thing of critical thinking. They're going to do the research skills. They're going to, you know, learn to reference and all that useful thing. So I think at the end of it, and this is, you know, my bias of my experience with music students, is they become very employable people because when they stand up, if you stand on stage and you have to do sing a song or play in a band, you also get that control of nerves. You also get the kind of, you know, things that you probably wouldn't get on other degrees. Now, I don't know what other degrees consist of, these ones that aren't Mickey Mouse degrees. But I would say that where do you get that sort of emotional intelligence? Where do you get that that control of nerves?
And that variety, the variety of instruction as well. So what we're describing is the stupidity, in a way, of thinking that if you go on a songwriting degree course and don't end up being the next Bacharach and David, then you've wasted your time and our money. Whereas in fact, that is a bit like me being told, because I did a degree in philosophy, that the fact that I'm not a philosopher is a proof that my degree was a waste of time.
Exactly that.
Wrong answer. You're supposed to say, but James, you are a philosopher.
Well, of course, yeah. But the thing is it's not up to us. Where it's kind of like I think sometimes with music courses they go, okay, well we're not going to have a million sort of Taylor Swifts or a million Ed Sheeran's coming out of these courses, or thousands, should I say.
Exactly.
But the thing is like it's like saying, are you doing a catering course? What, you're going to be the next Gordon Ramsay? If you're not, you fail. You know,
education is good in and of itself. It's an end in itself. It's not just a means to an end.
Indeed.
That's the point these people miss, sometimes deliberately. That's beautifully put. That really is. Thank you, Martin. Oh, crikey, the time. So we could tell it's a call that sucked me in, because I glance up and think, that can't be the time. It's 12:31. Amelia Cox has the headlines. 12:34 is the time. Some people... Karen, you're very funny. In fact, Karen, you're so funny that I began to think that I'd hit a rich seam of listeners there, but all of the ones that have made me splutter are all from you. They're all from the same person. So this is in answer to the question of what's the most unlikely organ that I could have once been paid to review video games for. Karen is responsible for all of these. Golf course architecture, Total Carp, Heritage Railway, the Pipeliners Hall of Fame News, Beef Today, I quite like that one, Onion World, Elevator World, The Oldie, that's feasible, or at least it exists, I don't know if the World of Pigs. You've got with respect, Karen, you've got far too much time on your hands. Why has everyone suggested Horse and Hound? Is that because of Hugh Grant in the film, where he pretends to be the film critic for Horse and Hound in order to get access to Julia Roberts, doesn't he? Isn't that what happens in Notting Hill? But loads of people have suggested Horse and Hound, and lots of you say, I mean, quite a few people say, I tell you what, it'd be very I bet it isn't, but it'd be very funny if it was the Daily Mail. Well, I'm here to tell you. I was the video games critic for the Daily Mail. And the maddest thing about that job, I didn't need a degree to do it, was the amount of free stuff I got sent, even though they paid us. I really miss all the free stuff. You name it, I got sent it. Absolutely happy days. But it coincided, after a lifetime of playing video games, from the ZX Spectrum onwards, it coincided with fatherhood. And so the games had got longer and bigger and more complicated. So just as I achieved a role that would have been beyond my wildest dreams. It's only a sideline. I was still doing this. But imagine for when I was in my teens and I did nothing but play video games. In my 20s, when the first thing I'd do, get in from work, put on the Sega Mega Drive. And then suddenly I'm being paid to do it, to play the games. I'm being sent every game under the sun. I'm being sent consoles, kit, merch. And because I'd just become a father, my world was changing. And it just never quite... I mean, oh dear. World's tiniest violin, if you would. 12:37. Josh is in Warrington to steer us back to Mickey Mouse degrees. Josh, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on again. Nice to speak to you.
You're very welcome.
So it's a really interesting one, this one. I think the term is still quite unfair for some of the ones that you listed. Well,
I love the idea that our friend's pal had a Mickey Mouse degree, it was called at the time, and he now works for Disney. I think that's perfect illustration of how unfair it can be.
Exactly, and if Cameron's comments were true from your previous caller, then, shows his usual assessments. However, I think, so I did English and stayed on to do a master's, and I now work in tech. I'm not actually the tech person, but basically my job is helping to make public or private sector services easier for people like you and me to use when you're trying to tax a car or, upload a picture onto something. And I do a lot of hiring for roles that might involve SEO or search or content management. And it's really fascinating because the people who I interview who've done the degrees in those things as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, they're quite on it in terms of the theory and the academia and the practice. But then when I interview them compared to people with a similar tenure of experience, but they've done either apprenticeship or they've just crammed as much in as they can online or helped their friends' Instagram business out or whatever it may be, they usually shine over the people who've maybe got 3 years and a degree in the subject. So and one of your previous callers, I think it was a video game chap, talked about how he sort of became a jack of all trades, master of none.
Yes.
And I think it's a complex one because, to your philosopher point, I went to university to do an English degree. I'd like to write a book, but I've definitely not done it yet. And I now work in tech. So I don't think you have to or not have to do a thing to become the thing. But so if you're going to university and spending $9,000, and to you that's a good value add for all the other life skills you get and being away from home and, presentation skills, and you also happen to learn a thing or two in how to manage media, how to get people to click things better. It might be good for you. But if you're looking at the potential 40 grand bill and wondering at the end of it, is this the best value add for me if I want to work in this job or that job? I think it becomes a more nuanced conversation then around...
Well, this is like the songwriting conversation, isn't it? Are you going to be the next Ed Sheeran? No, but that's really not the point.
Yeah, and that's why I think the Mickey Mouse term from kind of 2010 or whenever that first spawned isn't helpful. I mean, I imagine there maybe are some degrees where if you are just doing a study of, say, Taylor Swift's life and you might want to be her biographer or something, I can maybe see where the term comes from. But things like social media or content management, it's unfair, but it's more than a question of, for that person, what's the broader choices they could make if the outcome for them is the job. But I think you're right. I think fundamentally it's not a fair term.
But I mean, I'd have thought that your sector would be one of the sectors where academic training, as it were, or a degree was absolutely in lockstep with practical experience. I'd have thought that you as an employer would have inroads into local educational institutions. And what I'm hearing is that that's not the case at all.
In the pulse of the night, love ignites, burning bright. No escape, no retreat. In this madness, hearts beat. Through the chaos, we collide. A wild passion we can't hide. Lost in moments, lost in time. In this frenzy so sublime. Endless frenzy, no way out. In this love we twist and shout. No control, just you and me. Falling wild insanity.
No, not necessarily. No, that doesn't mean we don't overlap with them and we're adjacent. For example, I did a couple of talks last month for some NHS colleagues who work in tech to make services more accessible and talking about some kind of academic-ish themes within practice. But a lot of the things that we see are actually more like coding camps. So kids maybe in the summer or who are doing like part-time education, trying to bolster and be more hands-on, versus the actual degree diploma at the end, 2 to 3 year course.
I get it. Yeah, but that takes us back to the evolution question, doesn't it? So really, they should be, if you're running a course in one of these disciplines, you should be working harder to make links with employers like you.
And then employers like us and all sorts of employers, and maybe even more in the public sector as well. There should be some initiatives, ideally, where if you could have a 2 to 3 year degree, but as part of that 2 to 3 year degree in, say, content management, you were guaranteed a 6-month placement either in Department for Education or NHS Digital or Apple, wherever it may be.
Yeah.
You could then see a transformation in the degree as suddenly becoming almost like when engineers. My partner did a sandwich year away in Geneva for CERN, for example.
Wow.
Yeah, she's brilliant. But that sort of thing, if you could parallel those kinds of sandwich years where it mixes the vocation with the theory, I think it would completely change the landscape for those.
I think you're right. I think so. You're marrying vocation to the academics, or practical to theoretical. So crikey! And so the very worst thing that you can have in this space is a politician using the phrase Mickey Mouse degrees or deriding disciplines because all he's got experience of is people who are doing PPE or old school degrees that you could have done in the 19th century. Where did you grow up in Warrington? Do you mind me asking?
So I did mainly. I was technically born on the Shetland Islands, but I moved down when I was so young that I've basically lived in Warrington most of my life.
Okay.
So,
I got a mate who grew up in Stockport, and your accents are absolutely identical, which doesn't really make sense.
I think Warrington's that kind of non-Liverpool, but non-Manc.
Somewhere in between
really
the two. Yeah, it could be that. It could be that. Anyway, I just indulging my personal enthusiasm for English accents. Josh, thank you. 12:43 is the time. I'll tell you who'd have been good on this one. Andy, who tweets me all the time. I met him at one of my book signings. He very, very heavily involved in the Video Games Museum, but also he's just tweeted me to say, I'd love to call in to speak to you about so-called Mickey Mouse degrees, but we're a bit busy in a British esports board meeting right now, and we've got important business to do with exports and community work ahead. Now, British esports being the national body for competitive video gaming in Britain, which, again, oddly, because it was my dad, my late father, who was very dismissive of media studies degrees, because to his generation it made no sense. He went to work for the local newspapers at the age of 15, so and didn't get a degree until much later in life with the Open University. But oddly, many moons ago, when I think I was doing a paper review on Sky News or something like that, and I came off and I'd said something like not too far away from now. So I'd probably said 20 years from now, and we'd be going back, if I was still doing paper reviews on Sky News, we'd be going back 20, 25 years. And I said, we'll be buying tickets to watch highly paid people play video games. And I can't remember what the reception in the studio was, because it was completely overshadowed by the reception when I came out of the studio. And I answered the phone from my dad, who was still laughing. He thought it was the daftest thing that he'd ever heard in his life, because he'd, of course, watched me grow up with my ZX Spectrum plugged into my black and white television, playing very primitive video games. So the idea, but look how right I was, because esports is exactly that. You've got some people made the Fortnite. Didn't people make hundreds of thousands of pounds from being the best Fortnite players in the world? And now they've got Stadia. Massive in Korea, South Korea and other places. It is a spectator sport, playing video games, which is, even for someone who's played a lot of video games in their life, it is quite hard to credit. And I mention it because I think it plays into the idea of how silly it is to be dismissive. So you say, it's a Mickey Mouse degree. Well, it's not, though, is it? Especially not video game design or video game construction, video game coding. It's probably one of the most secure. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I imagine that the job opportunities there are much greater than they are in many other sectors. It's 12:45. It's 12:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the old phenomenon of Mickey Mouse degrees, which was in retrospect, I think, profoundly unfair nomenclature, has been resurrected, or at least there's an attempted resignation in the pages of the Daily Mail today, where somebody got told by a news editor who's presumably my age or older to ring around all the universities and find out what sort of courses they're offering, or indeed to check the clearing, check the UCAS website and see if you can find any degree courses that look like they shouldn't be degree courses. So they found 22 institutions offering courses in video gaming or esports. Huge growth industries, particularly in the context of video gaming, where Britain punches well above its weight. But yeah, hey, down with that sort of thing. 9 have social media courses, because who thinks social media is ever going to catch on? Why would you want to be one of the best informed and educated people about a sector like social media? Social schmedia, more like. That's never going to... I mean, how can you think that these things aren't worth studying? Digital content creation. What do you think digital content is, you loons? And then Rap and MC, which I thought that our caller in Grimsby, who runs a songwriting degree course, made a perfect case for that being so much more than the immediately obvious sum of its parts. But if you did a degree that other people perhaps refer to as Mickey Mouse, or did when you did it, were they right, or have you proved them wrong? 0345 6060 973. And here, on a completely different, Ipsos has done a poll. This is quite a staggering result, actually. Ipsos have done a poll, and what percentage of the population, according to this opinion poll, don't care who the next Tory leader is? So do it as a mark out of 10. Out of 10 people, out of every 10 people, how many actually don't care who the next leader of the Conservative Party is? This is really bad news for them, actually. So you text your answer on that if you want to, or WhatsApp it to me. 12:50 is the time. Back to the phone. Sal's in Bermondsey. Sal, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
big fan of your show.
Thank you. That's very good. It's only me.
A bit nervous. So my heart's a bit in my mouth because I've been on hold for a while, but okay. I'll try and explain a few points.
Thank you.
So yeah, I got onto a gaming degree, if you want to call it that, in inverted commas, Mickey Mouse degree in 2004.
Right.
And I graduated sort of in 2007, just before the financial crash. And the degree, in my eyes, like a lot of people who have said who have been on these degrees, is that you become kind of like a jack of all trades. People that are aware of like esports, and what I found out in my second year, one of the things I want to mention is that UCAS, for example, at the time, didn't have much knowledge about it. It was a fairly new sector. It was booming. So you had a lot of these degrees sprout up out of nowhere, and there was no like kind of industry involvement in the setup of these courses. So you never had anyone from like EA or Rare Games or any of these big gaming companies that came in to consult on what the content should be.
Did you smell a rat quite early on because of that? Did you think this or did your discovery come later?
Yeah. So in year two, we were not like, it was kind of like very broad subject. Like we were doing like a bit of 3D modeling here, and the course wasn't really design. Like it felt like the course was incomplete. Like you're paying for a service, and like the content was not there, and like the learning outcomes and what careers are afterwards was all kind of like in it was all very wordy and kind of foggy about what your future prospects would be.
So this is about the specific course that you did, rather than necessarily about the wisdom of or the validity of a course in gaming, isn't it? So it could have been good, but it wasn't.
But yeah, this is the point I want to try and make. So like I found so UCAS, that's one thing, didn't have enough information, so we went on to this course kind of blind. Then there was in year two, we found this, I found it was a website called Skillset.
Yeah. And
I don't know if it's still around, but basically it detailed a listed of gaming courses that were in partnership with industry. So you had a list of courses. There was some in Brighton, there was some in the north of England, in Edinburgh, for example, with universities that had partnered with gaming companies. And the gaming companies had basically set out, what the course would look like. And the course basically was quite intensive. So, for example, if you wanted to go into software engineering side of esports, you would need a degree that was heavily catered towards like maths and C++, for example, in programming. Whereas if you wanted to do the art side of it, of creating characters and all that kind of stuff, you'd better go to somewhere that is specialized in like 3D modeling. But either way, in the end, I didn't get into the gaming industry. I pivoted into something else because basically I couldn't break through because my course was too broad. I didn't have like a show reel or anything.
But
this
is again these are contributions that create in my mind the idea that it's a great idea to do these courses. They just need to be better than the ones that you did, better than the one that you did.
So the silver lining is So I completely agree. Like right now, the maturity of them is probably a lot better because there's a lot more people from these courses that are going into the gaming industry. However, what's probably made it a lot easier, and something that I'm kind of dealing with in my current workspace, is automation. So the fact that you've got AI and you've got these tools and utilities that you can use to essentially just throw your ideas into, kind of it's almost like you've got a co-pilot that writes the code for you, and you become a plumber. So you basically plumb and you stitch bits of code together that you might not necessarily have a depth of understanding in, but you know that you can plumb these bits of things together to create a game. And anyone can do this right now, by the way. If you've got access to AI, like ChatGPT, for example, you can stitch together whatever game you want to with whatever type of graphics you want. Obviously, there will be a little bit of jiggery pokery that you need to get around, but majority of people with any kind of sense could probably do it themselves.
Yeah, but again, I mean, there's a little bit of generational snobbery going on, because how many people who've done degrees in English literature have become novelists, or how many people who've done degrees in history have become historians? So it's about persuading, or it's about ensuring, rather, that the sum total of what you gather from doing one of these degrees justifies the investment of time and money over a 3-year period, and it definitely can in all of these areas. Jimmy makes an excellent point. He says, train to be a plumber, James. I don't think this is aimed directly at me. I'm doing all right, I think, Jimmy. If I had my time again, train to be a plumber. AI was going to eat up all of these jobs, and that comes from someone with 25 years of video game production experience. That kind of touches on some of the points that Sal was making as well. Matt says, I've got a politics degree, James. I don't think any politicians would call it a Mickey Mouse degree, but let's face it, it's hardly vocational. That's a very, very good point, actually. I loved it. I got a politics A-level. I'm not a politician. Does that mean it was a waste of time doing a politics A-level? It's odd, though, because some degrees are completely vocational. It'd be a bit odd to do a medical degree and not become a medic. I know some people don't. Harry Hill. Well, I think he did and then gave it up to be a comedian. But yes, so there is a weird interplay between vocational and educational, isn't there? Josh is in Chiswick. Probably the last word on this. It depends. There might be time for one more. Josh, what would you like to say?
Hey there, James. Well, just to say, I didn't do one of these so-called Mickey Mouse degrees. I did do media studies A-level, and then, like you, I went on to do a philosophy and politics degree. I'm not a philosopher, except when I'm sitting in an armchair. But then I went on to work in television, and I got into TV by winning a place on an apprenticeship, which gave me an MVQ level 3 after my degree. And that taught me everything I needed to know about working in TV. And my degree has had very, very limited input into that. And I think further training is important, like the last caller was saying. The courses where industry feeds in are really, really key, because there are massive skills shortages in the video games industry and the other sort of digital and creative industries in the UK at the moment. But I just think they have to be better. And I do wonder, with the sort of over-academicizing of everything, I don't even know if that's a word.
It is now.
That we send, that you heard it here first, that we send people down the academic route when actually a practical course might
as long as it. I mean, yeah, you'd be a good example of someone for whom it was, but it could be just as bad. You could be calling it a practical course, so you don't come away with an academic qualification, which is then transferable, because whatever your degree is in, it's still a degree, and there are jobs that are graduate level, graduate entry, graduate trainees. So you go off and do a practical course, it doesn't translate into employment, and you haven't got a qualification that's worth a fig outside of that very specific sector. Josh, thank you. I enjoyed that. The producer didn't think that was going to be very interesting. Shows what she knows. It's probably an age thing. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. So download Global Player for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now standing in for Sheila Fogarty, it's Matthew Wright. 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 It's Matthew